I was told the Terrans would send a war strategist, muttered a blue-jacketed Jarek guard. Arms crossed, compound eyes narrowing as the Earth delegation stepped from the docking platform. They sent that. The words fell like needles, quiet, sharp, and not meant for the human ear. But Varn Keswick heard them. He always did. He didn't flinch. He simply paused, adjusted the cuff of his gray uniform, and walked onward. The entry corridor to Zareth Prime's summit hall was shaped like a half-spiraled nautilus shell, walls lined with radiant goldstone veins that pulsed gently with atmospheric calibrations. Each step triggered a microtonal shift in ambient light. Delegates from 97 civilizations had arrived, draped in honor colors, biosignature flags displayed on back-mounted emitters, some gliding, some slithering, others escorted in reinforced containment pods. Terrans had sent a civilian, not a commander, not an admiral, not even a negotiator, just one man. And he walked alone. The air was heavy with controlled sterility, each breath filtered through Zareth's crystalline filtration towers. There was no trace of warmth. The scent was oddly dry, like limestone shaved against static. Lights above cast clean lines across the marbled floor, reflecting a distorted image of the Earth crest stitched into Keswick's shoulder, a raven cradling a scroll of ash. Near the summit's central gate, a voice crackled through a translator node embedded into the wall beside him. Terran credentials confirmed. You may enter the Hall of Accord. The obsidian doors split along an invisible seam and opened with the sound of granite peeling from itself. Keswick stepped through. Inside, the peace convergence had already begun. A tiered amphitheater, sculpted from vitrified stone, enclosed the summit like a coiled jaw. Delegates occupied seats organized by historical conflict ranking, those responsible for the most bloodshed, closest to the center. Earth sat near the outer rim, not by protocol, but by social gravity. Dozens of languages overlapped into a harmony of discord. Translation drones spun slowly between tiers, whispering contextual approximations to their assigned delegates. Keswick made no eye contact as he took his place, stationed at the far west lectern, a low platform marked only by a single input node and a deactivated laser plasma display. Above him, banners of interstellar peace agreements shimmered, their text shifting every few seconds between alphabets. A blank space remained where Earth's seal should have been. Across the hall, Jarek military officers adorned in spike-plated uniforms clustered near a tactical envoy from the Karth Dominion. One leaned over and tapped his claw against a translator orb. The Terrans sent a record keeper while we decide the future of warfare, he said. They must be far weaker than we imagined. The orb translated it aloud, across open channels, deliberately unmuted. Soft laughter broke out across multiple tiers, a rustling of mandibles, the chitter-click of appendages striking armrests in amusement. Keswick didn't turn. Draven Solt, the summit coordinator, a tall, willowy envoy from the diplomatic order of Nolvar Prime, gave a cough shaped to resemble neutrality. Honored delegates, he began, voice low, we will now begin the final session, post-conflict rebuilding and Terran studies. The hall dimmed slightly. Spotlights lowered themselves along metallic vines from the ceiling, bathing the stage in pale blue. Varn Keswick stepped forward. He did not clear his throat. He did not bow. He placed one hand on the lectern, leaned in, and activated the embedded display. Lines of Terran text illuminated in red gold. The script shimmered with encoded light pulses that scanned the room in arcing waves. A moment passed. Another Jarek delegate leaned forward. Do you intend to lecture us about rebuilding after you've been banished from over half your trade corridors? Stillness. Keswick tapped the panel once. The lights in the room flickered, just once. The display behind him came to life, not with a welcome message, but with a fully modeled planetary system. I won't speak of Earth's fragility, Keswick said at last. His voice was level, not loud, but it carried. Instead, I'll show you what fragility looks like. And that was the first ripple. The hall didn't go silent. Not yet. Some delegates exchanged glances. A few chuckled, nervously perhaps. The display's planetary projection hovered in mid-air, rotating gently. Labels formed: orbit axis, economic distribution, societal ideology flows. It wasn't Earth, but it looked familiar, too familiar. Therax Olum, The same Jarek who mocked him moments ago narrowed his eyes. He didn't finish. The simulation zoomed in. No explosions, no battleships, just an import route, subtly blinking red. Trade flow halted on a single axis. Fuel reserves diverted. Medical drone shortages logged. A time code began ticking in the corner. T plus 00031. This, Keswick murmured, is what happens when governance becomes predictable, when dependence replaces adaptability, when the wrong node is nudged at the right moment. He wasn't looking at the delegates. He stared at the display, watching as the modeled planet shifted. Ideological drift followed next. Randomized speech loops triggered chaos at public institutions. A fake cure, a delayed famine. No enemy identified, just fear that took root and fed on silence. The simulation's light turned colder, and slowly, a different silence began to form, not in the display, but in the room. Somewhere high in the outer tiers, a fervent diplomat stopped scribbling mid-note. A Maraxian observer dropped his data slate. Even the Karth Dominion envoy leaned forward, lips parting as power grids began to fail in the simulation, not with fire, but with harmony. Lights extinguished in synchronized patterns across the simulated world, like someone wiping order from a circuit board with one quiet breath. Therax Olam muttered something to a subordinate. The words didn't transmit. Keswick didn't blink. He didn't smile. He tapped again. The display darkened, not to black, but to blue. A simulation of the planet's orbital axis realigned. The temperature ranges flickered erratically. The magnetic field cracked, buckled, then dissolved. In the room no one laughed anymore. Keswick stepped back. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved beyond the lectern. He hadn't made a single threat. And still across 97 species, breathing in varying intervals, under biosuits, in natural skins, inside oxygen domes and neural shells, no one said a word. The Terran historian stood still, the simulation still running. Time code, T plus 00317. He had said barely 15 words, and the lesson had only begun. He speaks like a funeral curator, preparing to catalog his own bones. Therax Olm's remark cracked across the hall, half laughed, half declared. He didn't mask the tone, nor did he wait for the translation drones to repackage it. The Jarek commander wanted it heard raw. A slow tilt of heads followed. Around him, delegates flicked their eyes toward Varn Keswick, then back to Olm, calculating whether to grin, nod, or remain statues. Several opted for mild laughter, the kind that doesn't shake shoulders but resonates just enough to be performative. A spined delegate from the Orvex coalition emitted a rattle like wind scraping a bone chime. The Kelvy pair exchanged vibrating color shifts, an untranslatable sign of amusement. Somewhere in the back, even a Zaltonian diplomatic tutor smirked through his respiration mask. Varn Keswick remained at the lectern, motionless. Therax leaned against the edge of his curved seating tier, resting one segmented arm over the railing, as if he owned the room's oxygen. "Let us remind ourselves," he said, turning slightly for broader reach, "that Earth did not invent war. They simply documented their failures so thoroughly, they made footnotes look like doctrine." That drew chuckles. Louder this time, more confident. The ripple widened, growing legs and climbing tiers. Delegates chuckled. Translators stuttered from sarcasm overload. A second Jarek officer added, "I'm sure he has a table of contents for surrender policies." A ripple, then another. Keswick blinked. Once. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend. His silence wasn't passive. It was chosen, and that choice began to thicken the air like an unseen pressure front. A heads-up display above the stage quietly activated, its beam a silent arc of amber, scrolling unreadable glyphs in structured patterns. The lighting dimmed not by order, but by programmed cascade, section by section, tier by tier. The ambient brilliance receded into a low blue. Therax's grin stalled. "What? The Terran's display is allergic to brightness," he said, but now the chuckles faltered. A few delegates leaned forward, noticing the light wasn't reacting to room protocols. It was reacting to something else, something localized, controlled. Keswick moved, not dramatically, just a single hand rising to the edge of the lectern panel. He rotated the dial counterclockwise, one notch, and the platform vibrated, softly, subtly. The texture of the floor shifted beneath his boots. A green line, thin as a reed and pulsing every 2 seconds, etched itself into the heads-up display above. Text formed slowly, without theatrics. SIM Archive LX. Live mode enabled. The summit coordinator, Draven Sult, opened his mouth, closed it again. Therax pushed away from his post, standing taller, more alert now. Is this sanctioned? Draven blinked. Aye. The display protocols are typically preloaded. What is this? Keswick didn't answer. His hand hovered over the control pad. Another dial, another notch. Below the stage, the image reformed, no longer the simulated planetary model from earlier. This was more detailed. Topographical contours, etched in razor clarity. Population density maps flickering into view. Atmospheric alignment diagnostics. Gravity wells, satellite distributions, agriculture flow, trade ratios, and somewhere just left of the central orbital path, a label hovered in translated glyphs, Jarek 4 equivalent model. Therax stepped forward. End this, he said, voice tightening. Whatever this is, terminate it. It's a historical simulation, Keswick said flatly. That is not a historical model, that is my world. Keswick's voice never shifted. It's your structure, not your name. You have not been attacked. No action has occurred, only context. The delegates quieted again, but it was not the respectful quiet of diplomacy. It was the stillness before someone drops their glass and knows it will shatter. Molrik Vesh, an observer from the Dominion Intermediary Corps, leaned toward his heads-up slate. The orbital alignment is exact. That's not a coincidence. Draven tapped into the summit terminal beside him. I don't see this model in the registry. Therax's voice now bore a crack in its form. Then Earth violated simulation code. Keswick responded by turning one final dial. The projection responded immediately. A simple shift, one-axis rotation, not dramatic, not exaggerated, a 3.5-degree shift. Orbital realignment, unnatural, but plausible. Predictive alignment tools on the display began calculating changes. Global wind shear disrupted. Oceanic current patterns buckled. Temperature variance escalated in northern and southern hemispheres. Power grids flagged as unstable. Food distribution lines blinked red. Still no explosions, still no kinetic force, but the room had changed. Jaren Vosik, Earth's silent envoy seated in the third tier, logged the delegates' facial shifts into a micronode beside his palm. He said nothing, just recorded. Girl Fen, the data systems liaison from Zurit's summit board, spoke softly, almost apologetically. This isn't a visual mock-up. These outputs are live-fed. That model is running off a sim core rooted on Earth's primary military node. Therax stared at the display, and something behind his eyes flickered. Not fury, not panic. Calculation. You mean this simulation was pre-installed? He asked. No, girl answered. It's adjusting dynamically. The data input wasn't recorded. It's being processed live, based on your system templates, not Earth's. Keswick finally turned his gaze directly on Therax Ulm. There is no weapon here, no fleet, no planetary strike, just a historian, and a lesson. Therax raised his voice. This is intimidation. Keswick didn't blink. This is context. The laser plasma display began outlining secondary breakdowns, orbital mining economies failing, digital trust signals collapsing, mass data confusion during key seasons. The simulation was now 6 minutes in, and not a single bullet had been fired. Varn adjusted the panel again. A new window opened. This one showed no map, just timestamps, and below it the word Stage 1 completed. Initiating Stage 2. Therax's jaw tightened. The laughter had vanished completely now. Not even whispers followed. Some delegates averted their eyes. Others stared at their translators, waiting for guidance that wouldn't come. A few began transmitting quiet messages back to their embassies. Jaren Vosik marked this moment. Silence event. Cycle 1. Keswick placed both hands on the panel, slowly. No more movement, no more adjustments. The display ran itself now. He had stopped speaking, and yet the room continued to listen to him louder than anyone else. Timecode is live, Girl Fen whispered to no one in particular, his fingers twitching above his control slate like he didn't trust it not to bite. The heads-up display at the summit's apex blinked into a sharper, more granular focus, slicing planetary data across layers of glowing bands. The room adjusted its breath without realizing it. Varn Keswick said nothing. At T+00712, the simulated world expanded, its orbit axis turning silently beneath the translucent globe. Jarek 4's replica now spanned the display's entire arc, rotating at a slow crawl. Dozens of data lines mapped across the visual field, economic arteries, psychological fault lines, energy consumption patterns. The details weren't stylized, they were surgical. Trade entry points began stuttering, not collapsing, just glitching. Mineral transfers hesitated between checkpoints. Energy tolls doubled, then inexplicably reversed. A shipment of biospores from Sector Voel halted mid-orbit in the sim, flagged for antigen protocol recalibration, a term entirely fabricated by the simulation's logic loops. Therex Ulm narrowed his gaze. Those aren't real events. They're projections, Keswick answered, flat as a blade laid on a table, drawn from your own governance models. From the lower tiers, a member of the Hadri collective leaned forward, whispering in guttural clicks to his aide. A handful of delegates turned to their personal slates, searching, perhaps hoping to find a fault in the data feed. They found none. Trade flow charts shuddered again. Imports logged false positives for contamination. Customs algorithms reset. Currency floated outside indexed value. It was like watching a machine choke on clean code. A sudden color shift ran across the heads-up display, alert state beta. Then something subtle bloomed, barely noticeable at first. Advertisements, or what looked like them. A strip of public signage in the capital zone of the simulated world flickered, replacing its corporate banner with a meme in soft red text. Air filters lie. Breathe free. Another followed. Silence is their control. A feed of false news reports populated a civilian data stream node, projecting concern about an invented plague called white sleep. Panic about neural implants contaminated by off-world software sparked heated discussion. The sim's social trust index ticked downward by the second. This is synthetic mimetic warfare, Mulrich Vesh murmured. You've embedded psychological drift seeds into the cultural stream. It's not warfare, Keswick replied, eyes unmoved. It's a training model. Heads turned sharply. On screen, riots began to scatter, not large, not coordinated, but patterned. A university broadcast went dark mid-lecture, replaced by a voice urging withdrawal from governmental data nodes. News anchors stuttered on script as autoprompters injected conspiracy riddles. Children's cartoons broke transmission, inserting subliminal fragments urging resistance. Entire populations started folding inward, not because they were told to, but because logic no longer anchored their world. Delegate Draven Solt finally stood. What's the endpoint of this? He asked. Are we supposed to believe your model proves superiority? Keswick didn't glance away from the screen. It doesn't prove anything. It illustrates what happens when systems trust their own weight too much. A tertiary sub-display activated near the sim's periphery. It showed food supply data, spoiled rations, timing glitches in nutritional distribution, surveillance tools marking panic buying before the first actual shortage even occurred. A fabricated demand spiral, the kind that eats itself whole. From the far-right tier, Tolmac Dern, the Jarek military AI overseer, tapped his wrist-bound array, his voice filtered through a vocoder. Your simulation is triggering psychological auto-failures that mirror real historical outcomes. You're not just predicting collapse, you're curating it. The model is passive, Keswick said. It does not issue commands. It simply nudges truths into false order and watches logic unravel. Back on the main display, the sim archive's timeline counter climbed. T+001104. Therex Ulm's voice cracked slightly, though he tried to level it. You can't destabilize an entire society with a handful of lies. You don't need lies, Keswick said, still not turning. You need suggestion, doubt, delay, each more potent than missiles because no one sees them until they're already inside the house. Symbols on the display flickered again. A new screen surfaced, a district elections map shifting in real time, depicting rising candidates who had no prior recognition, all with tied slogans referencing false crises. Public forums flooded with automated votes. Governance collapsed not through force, but through overload. The display didn't flash, it pulsed. Disinformation load, 43% saturation, neural drift, threshold breached. Someone whispered a prayer in an unknown dialect. The silence afterward stretched thin, taut like wire drawn across the chest of the chamber. Therex's hand dropped to his comm bracelet. "End this," he snapped. "Now." Girl Fen turned slowly, his eyes caught between disbelief and duty. "I can't. The system isn't running through Summit servers. It's operating from a satellite-linked core routed directly through Earth's relay net." "Then shut down the relay." "You misunderstand," Girl said, the words dry in his throat. "We were never the host." More than a few delegates looked toward their translators, only to find the drone spinning in idle motion, unable to process their confusion fast enough. Keswick stepped away from the panel for the first time. "I'm not here to fight," he said softly, "nor to threaten. This model was built to train humans on rebuilding post-collapse. It simply shows what collapse looks like from the inside. When your systems can't tell truth from noise, even survival becomes optional." Therex's throat bobbed once, his voice barely carried. "You're showing us the end of our world." "No," Keswick said. "I'm showing you how easily it volunteers." At that exact moment, the simulation's timeline hit T+0013 o'clock. The last beacon of stability, a thermal distribution facility in the simulated equatorial zone, vanished from the map. Not bombed, not invaded, it just shut down. A scheduled firmware update executed a kill loop. With that, the simulated planet's energy grid flickered. Public lighting died sector by sector, each zone blinking out like extinguished candles. A sharp, breathy silence returned, and the simulation had only used suggestion. Earth hadn't fired a single weapon. "Why are the med centers showing red zone markers? That sector wasn't flagged." The words came from Tolmac Dern, spoken into his personal interface, yet they cut through the chamber like a split in fabric. Around him, the heads-up display rippled with sudden color realignment. Neon blues drained into violet, while green status bars thinned to flickering yellows. Across the simulation's globe, the once stable contour lines of Jarek 4's model began to stutter. Inside the central dome, the silence cracked. Timecode, T+001342, a medical transport route veered offline, triggering a cascade of alerts. The model's capital zone, Sector Varen, showed a looping failure icon over its pharmacological nexus. Then it duplicated. Another icon, then 4, dozens. Red spirals spun over Meddrone bays. The first full warning blared across the heads-up projection, in bold, unambiguous font: Civilian Health Infrastructure Failure, Node 92A. A voiceover began to echo in simulation, a female voice speaking softly in Jarek dialect, calm and instructive. She announced anti-inflammatory shortages, oxygen therapy delays, and a sudden audit of all genetic booster compounds. Her final phrase repeated, "Please remain calm while localized solutions are implemented." Then the voice looped 3 times. By the 4th, the audio glitched, compressing her sentence into a stuttering halftone that dragged out the phrase "remain calm" until it distorted into distortion. Delegate Mulrich Vesh stood rigid, eyes locked to his secondary console. His reading lenses slid off his nose and shattered against the cold stone floor. He didn't flinch. In the simulation, civilians began crowding pharmaceutical centers. A drone hovered over a cluster of patients, attempting to dispense queued prescriptions. It blinked red, then white, then powered down mid-flight, and dropped in a controlled descent onto a screaming youth's shoulder. Not a weapon, just a tool, failing. "Are these failure rates projected or algorithmically forced?" one of the Hadri analysts asked, his throat dry. "It doesn't force outcomes," Keswick replied without looking at them. "It introduces opportunity windows. Collapse follows the paths it already knew existed." Delegate Solt, now visibly pale under his species' translucent skin, pointed at the sequence accelerating across the equatorial sectors of the model. "That's not an error," he said. "That's rhythmic collapse. Every third substation is failing in measured sync. You're running a sabotage loop." Keswick answered flatly. "Predictive maintenance models determine which systems will fail under duress. The simulation simply amplifies probability to simulate stress response." The display showed a new pattern forming, carefully orchestrated. Power substations across 9 zones blinked offline in a wave, not simultaneously, but in calculated offsets. Zone 1A failed. 32 seconds later, 1B, then 2C, then 3F. The rhythm wasn't random, it was strategic. Therax Ulm turned sharply. You're choreographing a blackout. No, Keswick said. You already built it. We're just fast-forwarding. Another alert flared on the display. Temperature modulation failed. Sector 5Z. Energy conservation protocols triggered. Climate regulators shut down in hospitals. In the sim world, a neonatal wing's glass walls fogged as heating coils ceased. Cryogenic medicine storage units shut off, their insulation failing second by second. Simultaneously, public trust ratings began to plummet. A pair of city station governors argued across a fractured emergency network, their voices shouting over one another as the audience watched their words scroll on overlapping captions, their faces uncoordinated, sweat beading across one's scaled forehead, the other's eyes twitching as crowd riots surged in the background. Jaron Vosik noted it silently. Sim trust collapse triggered. Internal gov conflict detected. Girl Fen tapped the summit interface twice. This display just showed an emergency referendum was forced due to misinformation spread. They're voting on system-wide martial code, without any clear chain of command left. The Dominion delegate, Vesh, rubbed at his temples. You're fracturing the civilian structure without firing anything. Collapse, Keswick said, is often a vote. Another flash, this time in violet. Biological archive vault compromised. Emergency storage leak. In the lower quadrant of the display, a simulated pathogen, fabricated for the model, but based on real Terran case data, leaked into a metro station. No alarms, just simulated chaos. Misinformation suggested it had spread, and in that suggestion, people fled. Mass movement triggered transport collisions. Hospitals overflowed before any true infection vector was even logged. Back in the summit chamber, silence fractured again, but not with sound, with stillness. Delegates stopped breathing normally. They started watching with the kind of focus that forgets to blink. Who programmed this? Solt asked. No tactician thinks like this. They weren't tacticians, Keswick replied. They were civil historians, analysts, economists, behavioral psychologists. Therax's jaw twitched. You made war, academic. No, Keswick said, eyes unmoving. We made survival conditional. At T+00, 1551, the last synchronized power loop collapsed. The planetary grid in the sim dimmed, leaving only skeletal emergency overlays still flickering. Simulated cities darkened like coal-black embers across a fire map. A medical transport, its navigation disabled, spiraled off course into a broadcast tower. No explosion, no special effects, just a line of static and a sudden loss of transmission. Draven Solt whispered into his slate, then stopped when he realized it no longer connected. Back on the display, public screens across the simulated world showed the final emergency message: stay in place, help is en route. The same message looped in 17 dialects, but help never arrived, because in the simulation, no one was left capable of organizing the response. Jaron Vosik made one more notation: organizational collapse verified, simulation uninterrupted, and above it all, the world continued to spin, quiet, uninvaded, its orbit undisturbed. Yet on the heads-up display, the light inside that simulated civilization had begun to vanish one heartbeat at a time. Therax spoke without turning. This wasn't deterrence. No, Keswick said. This was the autopsy, and the simulation wasn't even halfway done. It's spinning the wrong way, muttered Tolmac Dern, barely audible, his tone not one of confusion, but dawning horror. The room didn't stir. It observed. On the summit's primary heads-up display, the simulated planet rotated peacefully until it didn't. A new line of data emerged beneath the simulation's axis marker. One small digit, incremented upward, 3.5 degrees, not lateral, axial. The simulated globe had begun to tilt. No explosions, no alarm tones, just data moving quietly into place. Above the planet's horizon curve, a pattern shift unfolded in the atmosphere. What had once been westward jet streams began swirling against their own historical direction. Cloud masses collided in unfamiliar bands, painting the troposphere in chaotic spirals that looked like bruises forming across skin too slow to react. The room remained suspended, between motion and comprehension. Keswick's badge blinked once. Observer active. Therax Ulm leaned forward, His claws now dug into the armrest before him, but he said nothing. No one did. There were no systems left in the simulation to protest. From the periphery of the display, a heads-up vector model unfurled across the bottom tier. It showed the mathematical implications of orbital drift, a projection of gravitational slippage, heat redistribution, magnetosphere decay. A secondary readout beneath the planet flickered red, then gray. Solar shielding, destabilized. Delegate Vesh closed his eyes. On the visual grid, the simulated sun's radiation began hitting areas previously protected by magnetic curvature. The sky turned amber in high-altitude zones. Ice caps flickered with unnatural glows. Storm bands exploded outward like ink spreading through water. Keswick had not spoken in several minutes. The data said everything. From the back row, a Kelvy representative pressed his translator node repeatedly, trying to issue a formal inquiry. The device refused to process. No response, because no one had coded this moment for diplomacy. In the simulation, crops failed first, not visibly. Through number counts, nutrient lines in soil registers evaporated. Carbon exchange collapsed in root systems as planetary temperature shifted just enough to disrupt the fungal biome underground. Food security percentages flipped, 72% viable, 41%, 9%. Then the animals followed. Creatures with temperature-sensitive organ structures collapsed across simulated plains, mass die-offs not from predator, plague or poison, but from simple atmospheric betrayal. The world itself had ceased to cooperate with life. Delegate Solt finally whispered, "This wasn't a simulation of failure." Keswick didn't move. Solt continued, "This is engineered extinction." There was no answer, no rebuttal, only another shift on the laser plasma panel. Wind currents reversal initiated. Over major population zones in the model, the weather imploded. Cyclonic storms burst outward instead of inward. Pressure zones clashed not because of force, but because of incompatibility. The pattern itself had been rewritten. An entire civilization now lived inside a planet whose rhythms were rewritten, where up and down no longer meant what they used to, where clouds spun against memory. "Stop it," said Mulrich Vesh. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply said it like a dying man making a final request to a machine. The simulation didn't pause. It wasn't responding to voice. It wasn't listening. It was finishing. On the display, coastal tides reversed into inland cities. Mountain snowfields sublimated before melting. Oxygen levels dipped in high-density zones due to chemical instability in photosynthetic organisms. The entire ecological baseline slid into chaos, not fast, but with mathematical grace, as if the universe itself had agreed with the simulation's verdict. "This planet isn't being bombed," Therax said at last. Jaren Vosik looked up. "It's being repurposed." Therax's mouth parted, but no words emerged. On screen, transport ships in orbit attempted realignment, but misfired their vectors due to planetary reorientation. Their orbital maps no longer matched the geometry they had trained for. A passenger freighter clipped the edge of a gravity well and crumpled, not exploded, just folded like a wing struck by still air. And on the ground, citizens did not run. They stared at the sky. In the simulation, a group of children in a mountain settlement watched clouds twist into helixes above their heads. They didn't scream. They didn't understand. The sky simply didn't look like theirs anymore. Therax finally asked what no one else wanted to. "Have you done this?" Keswick's head tilted slightly. "Only in theory." Girl Fenn's voice cracked mid-breath. This isn't theory anymore." Another symbol appeared on the interface. Magnetic alignment drift. Critical. Stars disappeared, not in the cosmos, but in the simulated sky. Astronomical markers blinked out of sync with their usual position. Navigation collapsed. Orientation became meaningless. The simulated species lost the ability to tell where they were in relation to anything else, and they didn't even know why. They hadn't seen a fleet. They hadn't detected an invasion. No fleet ever arrived. No soldier touched the surface. No order was given. Keswick's hands rested calmly on the console edge. The display dimmed slightly, enough to let the spinning clouds dominate the room's light, painting the faces of every observer with movement that no longer obeyed gravity's contract. A single word emerged, quiet, steady, typed into the Earth simulation's data signature. Irreversible. Tolmac Dern stood without knowing he'd done it. You tilted their planet, Keswick replied, eyes still fixed ahead, only a few degrees. The silence afterward was not peaceful, it was ceremonial. The simulation continued for 30 more seconds without another change in input. It no longer needed one. The systems had collapsed far enough to carry themselves downward without further assistance. Self-destruction had become autonomous, and Earth had done it without touching anything. Varn Keswick's badge blinked once more. Observer complete. Shut it down, barked Draven Solt, his voice cutting upward in a desperate pitch that abandoned every trace of neutrality. His position demanded. No response came. The room had splintered, not physically, but in posture, in breath, in gaze. Delegates who once leaned back with disdain now gripped railings, eyes darting from display to slate to Keswick, and back again. Some whispered. Others sat entirely still, afraid movement might confirm something irreversible. Across the central heads-up display, the simulation's global map had gone translucent, replaced by a spiraling feed of fault logs, economic failure, ecological rejection, population exodus, not toward hope, but toward anywhere that wasn't home. A sudden crack echoed, not from the display, but from a body. Malrik Vesh collapsed sideways in his tiered seat, one arm limp against the rim. His aide tried to lift him, but the Dominion delegate's glass data slate slipped from his sleeve and shattered. Pieces scattered across the floor, jagged like broken ice beneath a boot heel. No one rushed forward. The air had turned too heavy for courage. Gurl Fenn leaned over the summit console, fingers flying across input glyphs, locking command port, disengaging sim feed node, rerouting through local. The screen blinked once, then responded with a single phrase pulsing in bright crimson: access denied, command privilege exceeded. Draven stared. He tapped again. Another message flashed. Route relay Earth primary node. Override not permitted. Delegate Keswick, he choked out. Is there any reversal code? Keswick didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. He stood exactly where he had been, as if made of stone that had once learned how to breathe, and then decided not to bother. Tolmac Dern stepped backward. This isn't containment, he whispered. This is exposure. We're being made to feel extinction. No, said Vosik, still seated. We're being made to understand what it feels like to be too late. Behind them, the room's environmental gradient dropped by a single degree. The effect was barely perceptible, but enough for every species sensitive to microclimate changes to register discomfort. The illusion was collapsing into reality, not in threat, but in shared low-level dread. Therax Ulm didn't move. His stare had become fixed on the rotating planet now overlaid with a dark mesh of finality. Environment unstable, core systems rejected. Another delegate screamed, not words, just sound, and slammed his translator against the floor. It cracked, but the translator blinked once and attempted to reboot. The summit coordinator, still frozen at the podium, drew breath. Keswick, this is no longer a simulation. This is psychological warfare. No, Keswick replied. It's historical relevance. Someone near the mid-tier shouted. You're training with planetary death. It's not death, Keswick replied, unless they refuse the lesson. A ripple of footsteps broke the chamber's unnatural stillness as two Virene advisors stood and began leaving their seats, abandoning decorum. Their gestures were erratic, angular, like they'd forgotten how to carry their own limbs. On the display, final atmospheric models cascaded into failure. Color drained from temperature bands. Dust storms began to blanket simulated continents. A meteorology overlay appeared, but there were no forecasts, just lines of undecipherable variables folding into each other like an equation choking on itself. Jaren Vosik tapped once on his armband console. It recorded everything: the micro-reactions, the attempted overrides, the physiological changes, sweat levels, thermal spikes, pulse rates of 12 distinct species. He didn't interrupt. That wasn't his function. He logged. He archived. He bore witness. Draven lifted the backup command tablet from beneath the summit's emergency channel port, scanned his wrist ID, and ran the override protocol. The tablet locked. Message displayed. Tampering protocol initiated. Sanctions logged. Earth command review pending. He let the device drop. It hit the floor and spun. No one reached for it. Therax stood now, not in protest, in admission. He stared across the chamber at Keswick. voice lower now, broken in tone, not volume. Why send you? Because the louder the weapon, Keswick said, the easier it is to dismiss. Solt moved his hand, then lowered it. You're not a soldier. I never claimed to be. You just did what armies couldn't. Keswick didn't nod. He didn't smile. But for a moment, the faintest gleam shimmered across his eyes. Not triumph. Recognition. As if someone in the room had finally said something accurate. The simulation reached T+00, 1959. 1 second before the 20-minute mark, the screen transitioned into monochrome. Each contour of the simulated planet, now reduced to shades of ash and snowfall, wind noise data layered over crumbling infrastructure. At the bottom of the panel, planetary collapse, full integration complete. The moment that line appeared, half the chamber exhaled in unison, as if they'd been holding their breath for an outcome that never reversed. No flame, no radiation, no swarm, just an ending. Planned, measured, logged. Jaren Vosik's log status updated automatically. Council reaction stage. Dissonance. Suppression. Girl spoke again. Finally. We can't outvote this. No, Solt said, quieter now. We missed our chance to debate it. The lights above the chamber flickered, not from failure, but from the simulation's control node prompting real-time environmental dimming for atmospheric effect. Every shadow stretched wider. Every figure stood less clear. Keswick turned to the laser plasma screen, tapped a final sequence, and walked back to center. The display didn't show him. It showed one word, observed. And from that moment on, Earth's presence needed no explanation. It's gone, someone whispered. No name attached, no species identified. Just a voice, dry, almost reverent, spilled into the silence that followed the word observed on the summit display. It lingered there for a breath longer than necessary, then faded as all lights dimmed to accommodate the simulation's final sequence. The heads-up display flickered once, not from error, but transition. A new filter layered across the simulated planet, its texture coarser now, less digital, and more like grain etched into an old canvas. Mountains lost their silhouette. Cities faded beneath layers of suspended ash. Even the oceans had turned the color of aging iron, reflecting nothing, holding no motion. The magnetic field indicator, once a gentle arc of cerulean pulses, cracked, its waveform stuttered, then inverted. Beneath it, the notification bled onto the lower left of the panel, magnetic shield integrity, 0%. Not even a shield, murmured Solt, no longer addressing anyone. On screen the world stood bare, with no field left to ward it. The planet's skies peeled away in strips of red and copper. It was not fire, not an explosion, just unraveling. Atmospheric gases, deprived of molecular grip, escaped into nothingness, pulled by gravity's failing handshake. A translucent veil crept from pole to pole, almost like fabric dragged slowly over a dead face. It was the color of raw embers, and it did not stop. The summit remained wordless. Even the translation drones hovered in idle cycles, no longer interpreting. There was nothing left to translate. What they witnessed defied language. It entered something older. Primal. Varn Keswick didn't look up. He didn't need to. He had seen this play out before, in labs, in sandboxes, in theory simulations back on Earth, but never in a room like this. Never before 97 civilizations. Never before the architects of arrogance, stripped of certainty. Across the display's upper quadrant, the red veil thickened. It no longer looked like weather. It resembled a curtain drawn against creation, one last shroud before darkness. Molrik Vesh stirred, slowly regaining posture after his collapse. His first act wasn't speech, it was watching. Beneath the simulation, a pulse of light emerged from the planetary core animation, dim, faint. It was not radiation. It was entropy measured through residual kinetic energy. What remained of tectonic movement after environmental collapse. The planet had stopped breathing, but its bones still murmured. The light flickered once, then extinguished. Tolmac Dern whispered, "That's a dead core." And just like that, the planet stopped rotating. Not suddenly, not violently. It simply ceased. The spin stabilized to null, motionless against the projection frame. The atmosphere had fully dissipated. No cloud structure remained. Oceans had become inert pools of chemical slush. Artificial satellites drifted away, losing orbital lock. Every movement that had once defined civilization, gone. A new phrase appeared at the center of the display. Simulation status. Inert. One word beneath it, cold and final. Extinction. Therax Olm hadn't moved. His body remained as upright as ever, but his face, what once displayed pride, then contempt, now only held a single crushing vacancy. He had become sculpture. Jaren Vosik made no entry this time. There was nothing to log. The performance had ended. And yet, no applause followed. Keswick turned toward the crowd. For the first time since the veil fell, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He simply placed his hand flat across the control panel, where the last commands rested, unneeded now. "You cannot reason with a storm you cause," he said, "nor survive the silence left behind it." Gurl Fen finally broke from his station, eyes wide as he faced the Terran. "This was just a model. It was a mirror," Keswick replied. On the display, the dimmed globe began to fade, not with speed, but with deliberate slowness. Each continent, each ocean, each line of civilization blurred into smudges of gray, like chalk rubbed from stone. A planet-shaped silhouette remained, hollow, void of color, void of meaning, and then, it vanished. Only the black background remained, blank. A heads-up log tag emerged in the corner, time-stamped, SimWorld log ID, Jarek proxy, outcome collapse confirmed, system response, none. That was the final notation. The display powered down. No one moved. No one reached for the lights. Even the translation drones drifted lower in the air, as if exhausted. A reverent dread settled over the chamber, not from weaponry or conquest, but from understanding. This was not a war Earth had threatened to wage. It was a lesson Earth had proven no one else could survive, and the lesson was over. The silence was no longer tactical. It had become sacred. "There is no reset," Varn Keswick said. "No amplification, no rhetorical arc." He spoke those 4 words into a room that had become so still, even the automated drones had stopped correcting posture cues. The SIM archive display had faded into darkness, the panel reading only one message in dim green: sequence finalized. No active nodes, nothing buzzed, nothing blinked, nothing moved, except him. He stood at center stage, framed by the remnants of a projection that had carried an entire civilization to its simulated death, and faced 97 delegations who now understood silence, not as absence, but as punishment. Therax Olm didn't meet his gaze. His hands were folded, fingertips curled toward the rim of the console, as though gripping something that wasn't there. Tolmac Dern looked hollowed out, not defeated, emptied. The kind of vacancy that follows too many facts, swallowed in too short a span of time. Draven Solt, the summit coordinator, remained frozen near the fallback command terminal, the shattered override tablet still on the floor beside him. He had not retrieved it. There was no function left to retrieve. Keswick didn't pace. He didn't gesture. He allowed silence to stretch, measured and thin, until the weight of what had been shown could no longer compete with the weight of what hadn't yet been said. "You invited a voice," he began, and laughed when it didn't carry armor. One of the Varad delegates shifted in his seat, his shoulder plates clicking softly as he adjusted his breathing mask, but he didn't speak. No one did. "You assumed quiet meant weak. That restraint implied absence, that civilians were ornamental. But Earth has never measured threat by posture." He glanced toward the tiered observers. Some looked away. Others stared like students caught unprepared for a lesson they didn't believe they'd need. "We build models, not ultimatums. We simulate consequences, not invasions. And when we teach history, what we actually teach is not the path of victors, but the fate of those who believe their strength guaranteed time." A faint breeze brushed through the chamber, the climate controls adjusting to compensate for the slight drop in room temperature, 1 degree, nothing more. But in that cold drift, the room felt less like a council, and more like a tomb. Keswick continued, "We did not arrive with weapons because Earth no longer needs to warn. We record, we model, and we educate. Not to inspire fear, but to prevent repetition." No one interrupted. Even the Kelvii, normally incapable of extended stillness, had stopped pulsing through their chromatic expressions. Their color remained fixed, a soft, dull gray of submission. "You witnessed collapse, not because we wished for yours. You saw it because your structure mirrored it too closely." He turned slightly now, just enough to address the room as a whole. The simulation you watched was not a prophecy, it was a reflection, tailored by your own public records, your supply networks, your coded logic structures, and your trust thresholds, nothing fabricated, nothing forced. A low murmur tried to rise from the back of the chamber. It died halfway to sound. Whatever courage it carried, it couldn't lift the air. Keswick lowered his voice, not from fatigue, but from purpose. We showed you nothing Earth hasn't already tested. One of the Hadri leaned back slowly, exoskeletal joints crackling with weight. His lips parted slightly, but his translator flickered once and remained mute. And nothing we haven't survived. The final line hung, not like threat, like gravity. He turned to leave. No bows, no formal closure, no ceremonial handoff of authority. He stepped from the stage with the same pace he'd walked onto it, unrushed, unbothered. The summit floor didn't shift, the lights didn't brighten, the system didn't reset. His back turned, his presence retreating toward the doors through which he had entered alone, unguarded. The display behind him remained dark, except for one final cue, soft, tucked into the bottom corner of the heads-up projection, barely lit, but unmistakable in its calm delivery. SIM archive node securely logged. Earth protocol HX null, complete. Draven Solt finally moved, one hand rising toward his collar, not for diplomacy, but to loosen something constricting his breath. Keswick reached the threshold, stopped, turned his head just enough to cast a final thought over his shoulder, low even, emotionless. History is not written by victors. A pause, a breath, then softer, it's written by survivors. He stepped into the corridor beyond the council chamber. The doors slid closed behind him, and no one followed. Remove him. The order didn't echo. It didn't carry authority. It was authority. Tolmac Dern didn't wait for consensus. No vote was cast. No protest came from the delegation. Thrax Ulm remained seated as two Xeric military aides approached in silence and placed a single black clasp across his command crest. Not arrest, not disgrace, just extraction from relevance. He didn't speak. He didn't resist. Across the summit chamber, no one turned to watch him go. Every gaze was on the heads-up diplomatic relay now pulsing above the Central Council console. A list scrolled vertically. 12 empires, 12 digital seals. One after the next, they stamped agreement onto the freshly generated Treaty of Conditional Neutrality, each name locked beside a glowing insignia. Terms: no aggressive deployment against Terran systems, no covert interference in Terran development, no AI data trace probing on Earth's sovereign networks, no clause for negotiation, no terms for expiration. Earth had not offered the choice of war or peace. It had offered understanding or consequence, and understanding had been chosen. A fresh entry blinked into view, the Thurlan Consortium, then another, the Varane Assembly. 12 became 13, 14, then 15. Thrax was gone, and no one mentioned his name again. From orbit, Earth's transport, Ravel, remained a static shadow against the crescent limb of Xeric Prime. No transmissions, no trajectory adjustments, just presence, unmoving, watching. Jaren Volsik stood alone at the observatory module, his notes complete. Every facial twitch, every shiver of realization, every failed override, logged, encoded, archived. No farewell message transmitted, no thanks offered, no instruction left behind. That was never the point. Inside the summit chamber, the laser plasma display at last shut down fully, its surface returning to inert matte. Above it, the ceremonial light vine running across the chamber's inner dome, dimmed for the first time in recorded memory. No official act caused it. It dimmed because the chamber no longer felt like a place of guidance. It felt like a relic. Solt removed his summit crest and placed it in his lap. Girl Fen leaned over and whispered, "Do we initiate recovery?" Solt didn't answer. "Should we draft response consensus?" Fen asked, voice lower now, gentler. Solt looked up. Draft what, girl? He wasn't seeking rhetorical comfort. He was simply out of language. In the outer sectors, broadcasts had already shifted. News relays no longer discussed war probabilities. They speculated on Terran modeling. Analysts debated whether the simulation had been symbolic, or whether Earth had simulated actual contingency plans. That question, answerless, became its own deterrent. Children in frontier systems began asking about Earth's educational methods, quiet queries about how to learn what humans had learned. In places where planetary defense had once been a proud mantra, conversations turned inward. What in our world could unravel if no enemy ever fired? Fear had not spread. Fear requires chaos. This was worse. Respect had anchored itself, quiet, immovable. Inside the diplomatic wing's final corridor, Varn Keswick walked alone toward the awaiting lift that would take him back to the Ravel. His pace matched the stillness behind him, unhurried, unslowed. A young liaison, unnamed, too new to have been part of the summit, stood by the departure gate, hands trembling around a message slate. He stepped forward. "I wasn't part of that," he stammered. Keswick stopped, not unkindly. The liaison's hands shook harder. "I just wanted to understand. Was it real?" Keswick met his eyes, not with challenge, with stillness. "You're asking the wrong question," he replied. The liaison frowned. "What's the right one?" Keswick stepped past him, voice steady. "Ask if it matters." The lift opened. He entered, didn't look back, didn't need to. The doors closed, sealing a silence no treaty could match. 2 hours later, Earth's diplomatic channels sent a single transmission to the Galactic Accord Council, text only, no signature, just a file header. Some archive lectured event reference ID, HX null classification, public. It was made available to every system, every moon, every archive, no security, no encryption. Anyone, citizen or sovereign, could view the demonstration that had rewritten the room where war was once spoken of as a tool, and that was all Earth sent. Not an army, not a claim, not even a warning, just history. A week later, the Xeric military announced the restructuring of its planetary climate protocols and initiated audits of ideological reinforcement campaigns. They did not cite Earth by name, but in private documents leaked months later, a single internal directive appeared: "Do not mock scholars again." It was followed by a second clause: "Education is the final weapon." And so the title of the summit, "The Peace Convergence," took on new meaning, not because war had been ended, but because war had been shown its reflection, and found nothing of itself worth continuing. In the absence of fire, Earth had brought something colder, something older, not conquest, not diplomacy, only consequence. And in the halls where laughter once welcomed the Terran historian, only silence remained. But it was not defeat, it was acknowledgement. Earth had been underestimated for the last time, because history, after all, isn't written by the loudest, it's written by the ones who finish the page.